164 years ago, they found Archaeopteryx, the first bird or the last dinosaur, depending on how you want to look at it. Since then, that question has never been closed. In 2025, scientists described the 14th specimen, with the first tertial wing feathers ever found in this animal, the 14th, in 164 years. That tells you something about how rare these transitional forms are and how much each new discovery rewrites something fundamental. Because the transition from dinosaur to bird is not a straight line from A to B. It is an explosion of evolutionary experiments, most of which failed. Four-winged dinosaurs, creatures with membranous wings like a flying squirrel, birds with teeth. Only one experiment survived the asteroid 66 million years ago, and today there are 10,000 species of them. Before we get down to business, please subscribe to this channel. Your support really helps us to continue this work. Thank you. There is a particular kind of scientific mystery that science solves and then immediately discovers it has not solved at all, only pushed the boundary of the unknown one step further back into deeper and stranger territory. The origin of birds is that kind of mystery. For most of the 19th century, the question was simple and apparently unanswerable. Birds were birds, a unique and separate category of life defined by their feathers, their hollow bones, their warm blood, and their ability to fly. The reptiles were reptiles. The dinosaurs were reptiles, dead and buried under Cretaceous rock. Nobody seriously proposed a connection between the two groups until Charles Darwin published On the Origin of Species in 1859. And the intellectual climate became, for the first time, one in which the deep evolutionary relationships between apparently different groups of animals could be scientifically investigated rather than philosophically dismissed. 2 years later, in 1861, a limestone quarry in the Solnhofen region of Bavaria produced what would become one of the most famous fossils in the history of natural science. And the mystery, instead of being solved, became magnificently, permanently, productively complicated. The Solnhofen limestone is a geological accident of extraordinary scientific value. During the late Jurassic period, approximately 150 million years ago, the region that is now Bavaria was a tropical archipelago of small islands and shallow lagoons bordering the ancient Tethys Sea. The water in these lagoons was warm, highly saline, and oxygen depleted at the bottom. Conditions that prevented the biological decay that normally destroys organic remains before they can be mineralized. Animals and plants that fell into these lagoons or were washed into them by storms were preserved in remarkable detail in the fine-grained sediment that accumulated in the anoxic depths. The Solnhofen limestone has yielded an extraordinary catalogue of late Jurassic life. Exquisitely preserved fish, marine reptiles, pterosaurs with soft tissue wing membranes intact, insects with every vein of their wings legible under a hand lens, and, most famously, the animal that would generate 160 years of scientific argument about the most consequential biological transition in the history of vertebrates. The first recognized Archaeopteryx specimen was a single feather, found in 1860 and described in 1861 by the German paleontologist Hermann von Meyer. The feather was unambiguously avian in its structure, asymmetric, with a rachis and interlocking barbs arranged in the pattern characteristic of a flight feather. Yet it was embedded in limestone 150 million years old, from an era when no birds were supposed to exist. Months later, a partial skeleton was recovered from the same formation, followed in 1877 by the magnificent Berlin specimen, a nearly complete skeleton with skull, articulated limbs, and the clear impressions of feathers preserved around the entire body. The Berlin specimen is still displayed at the Museum für Naturkunde in Berlin, and it remains one of the most extraordinary objects in the history of paleontology, an animal that is simultaneously, unmistakably, a small feathered theropod dinosaur and an undeniable candidate for the earliest bird. The anatomy of Archaeopteryx embodied the paradox that would drive evolutionary biology for the next century and a half. On the dinosaurian side, a mouth full of small, sharp teeth with no trace of a beak, a long, bony tail composed of approximately 20 vertebrae, rather than the fused pygostyle that supports the tail feathers of modern birds. Clawed digits on the forelimbs, visible in multiple specimens as distinct curved claws projecting from the wing bones. Unfused bones in the wrist, shoulder, and pelvis that in modern birds are consolidated into the rigid, flight-optimized skeleton that allows efficient powered flight. On the avian side, asymmetric flight feathers, identical in microstructure to the flight feathers of modern birds. A wishbone, the furcula, formed by the fusion of the clavicles, a structure present in modern birds and known to function as a spring in the flight stroke. A reversed first toe, suggesting an ability to perch. Brain anatomy, revealed by CT scanning in subsequent decades, showing enlargement of the visual and balance processing centers associated with flight. The 14th specimen, described by paleoornithologist Jingmai O'Connor and colleagues in 2025, added new layers to this already complex picture. The Chicago Archaeopteryx, named for the Field Museum of Natural History where it is now housed, was prepared using advanced CT scanning and microcomputed tomography techniques that revealed features invisible in the rock surface. Among the most significant findings were tertial feathers, specialized inner secondary flight feathers that in modern birds connect the wing to the body, filling the gap between the outer flight surface and the body wall, and allowing the wing to function as a continuous aerodynamic surface, rather than a disconnected flapping appendage. The presence of tertials in Archaeopteryx, never previously documented in any specimen despite 160 years of examination, suggests that at least some individuals of this species had a more complete and aerodynamically functional wing than previously appreciated. The same specimen revealed cranial kinesis, the ability of bones within the skull to move relative to each other, in a pattern similar to modern birds, and preserved soft tissue around the feet, suggesting a degree of tactile sensitivity that may have aided perching and maneuvering in complex environments. But before we can understand what Archaeopteryx was doing in the late Jurassic lagoons of Bavaria, we need to understand the world it came from, the world of the theropod dinosaurs, and how that world, over tens of millions of years, produced the anatomical raw materials from which the first birds were assembled. The theropods were bipedal, predominantly carnivorous dinosaurs that first appeared in the Triassic period approximately 230 million years ago, and that, by the late Jurassic, had diversified into an extraordinary range of ecological roles across every major continent. They ranged in size from Compsognathus, a chicken-sized predator from the same Solnhofen formation that produced Archaeopteryx, to the enormous apex predators of the Cretaceous, including Tyrannosaurus rex and its relatives. But it was not from the giant theropods that birds descended. The bird lineage traces its origin to the Coelurosaurs, the group of small to medium-sized theropods that includes the Dromaeosaurids, the Troodontids, and their relatives. The animals most closely related to modern birds on the dinosaur family tree. The Coelurosaurs shared a suite of anatomical features that would prove to be pre-adaptations for flight, evolutionary characteristics that evolved for one function and were later co-opted for another. Bipedal posture freed the forelimbs from any locomotory role, leaving the arms available for other uses. Hollow bones, evolved apparently to reduce the metabolic cost of building and maintaining the skeleton, also reduced the weight of the body and increased the energetic efficiency of movement. A rapid metabolic rate, indicated by bone histology consistent with endothermy, the ability to generate body heat internally, provided the energetic output necessary to sustain the vigorous muscular activity that powered flight requires. A wishbone, now known to be present in virtually all theropods and not just birds, provided the elastic spring that stores and releases energy during the flight stroke. Most remarkably, many Coelurosaurs had feathers, structures that, when first discovered in fossilized theropods, were so unexpected that the initial reaction of many paleontologists was disbelief. The story of the discovery of feathered dinosaurs is itself one of the great narratives of late 20th century science, and it centers on a series of fossil sites in the Liaoning province of northeastern China, where the fine-grained lacustrine and volcanic sediments of the Yixian and Jiufotang formations have preserved, with extraordinary fidelity, the soft tissues and integumentary structures of the animals that lived in this early Cretaceous environment, approximately 125 million years ago. The first Liaoning feathered dinosaur to be formally described to the scientific world was Sinosauropteryx prima, announced in 1996, a small compsognathid theropod, the approximate size and general proportions of a large cat, covered in a coat of simple filamentous structures along its back and tail. These structures were not true feathers in the fully developed sense. They lacked the complex branching rachis and barb architecture of flight feathers, but they were unambiguously not scales, not collagen fibers, not any other known integumentary structure. They were proto-feathers, simple, hair-like filaments composed of beta-keratin, the same protein that forms the feathers of modern birds and the scales of modern reptiles. The announcement of Sinosauropteryx at the annual meeting of the Society of Vertebrate Paleontology in 1996 produced one of the most famous emotional responses in the history of paleontology. Larry Martin, a paleontologist who had spent his career arguing that birds did not descend from dinosaurs, reportedly began to cry when he saw the fossil, not from joy at the discovery, but from the devastation of seeing the evidence against his life's work laid out before him in undeniable physical form. The Liaoning Formation continued to yield feathered theropods in growing numbers through the late 1990s and 2000s. Protarchaeopteryx, Caudipteryx, Beipiaosaurus, Sinornithosaurus. Each new genus added detail to the picture of how feathers evolved and how the transition from non-avian to avian biology proceeded. A study published in Nature Communications in February 2025 by Yang, Pittman, and colleagues at University College Cork examined a new specimen of Psittacosaurus, an early Cretaceous ceratopsian, not a theropod, but a dinosaur nonetheless, and found something remarkable: a body covering that combined zones of reptilian scales with zones of proto-feathery structures in different regions of the same animal. This zoned development, described by the authors as compartmentalized skin with distinct regions of scale-bearing and feather-bearing epidermis on the same individual, suggests that the transition from scales to feathers was not a single instantaneous evolutionary event that replaced one type of covering with another, but a mosaic process that proceeded region by region across the body surface, with different areas of the skin following different developmental trajectories. The same genes that control scale development in modern reptiles, when modified by specific regulatory mutations, produce feather follicles instead. And the Psittacosaurus specimen suggests that intermediate conditions, with both scales and proto-feathers present on the same animal, were a real and functionally viable transitional state that persisted across millions of years and multiple dinosaur lineages. The functional significance of these early feathers, before they acquired any aerodynamic function, is a question that has generated substantial research and some genuine controversy. The simplest and most widely accepted explanation is thermoregulation. A coat of simple filamentous proto-feathers would trap an insulating layer of air next to the skin, reducing heat loss in cool environments. In much the same way that the fur of modern mammals or the down feathers of modern birds function as thermal insulation. This interpretation is supported by the apparent distribution of proto-feathers on the bodies of early feathered theropods, which tends to match the distribution of insulating body coverings in modern endotherms, concentrated on the dorsal surface and flanks, where heat loss is greatest. Additional proposed functions for early feathers include display. The elaborate, elongated feather-like structures on the tail and arms of animals like Caudipteryx and Protarchaeopteryx are almost certainly too large and too structurally complex for simple insulation, suggesting a display function comparable to the ornamental plumage of modern peacocks or birds of paradise, and brooding, the covering of eggs to maintain incubation temperature. Several exquisitely preserved specimens of oviraptorid dinosaurs have been found in postures consistent with brooding their nests, with the forearms spread in a posture strikingly similar to that of a modern bird covering its clutch, suggesting that the use of feathered forearms to cover and warm eggs predates the use of those same feathered forearms for flight. The transition from simple filamentous protofeathers to the fully developed asymmetric, aerodynamically functional flight feathers of modern birds occurred in at least 4 recognizable evolutionary stages, each of which is preserved in the fossil record by different species at different levels of complexity. Stage 1 was the simple, unbranched filament, a single keratin strand emerging from a follicle in the skin, providing insulation and nothing else. Stage 2 added branching. The simple filament developed lateral branches, creating a structure more similar to a modern feather in overall architecture, but without the interlocking hooklets that bind adjacent barbs together into the coherent, aerodynamically smooth surface of a flight feather. Stage 3 produced a more complex structure with a defined central rachis and barbs extending on either side, but with the barbs symmetrically arranged on both sides of the rachis. A symmetry that, in terms of aerodynamics, produces a feather that generates equal lift on both sides and is better suited for insulation or display than for flight. Stage 4, the asymmetric flight feather, has the barbs arranged asymmetrically, with a narrower leading vein and a wider trailing vein, a geometry that, as any aeronautical engineer will recognize, creates an airfoil cross-section that generates lift when moved through air. The asymmetric flight feather is the solution to the aerodynamic problem of flight, and it appears in the fossil record precisely in those species: Archaeopteryx, Microraptor, and their close relatives, that are the most likely candidates for the earliest flyers. To understand why the theropods and not some other group of animals made this transition, it is necessary to spend some time with the biology of theropod dinosaurs as it was before feathers entered the picture, before any of the evolutionary story we are telling had begun to unfold. The theropods were not simply large predators distinguished from other dinosaurs by their bipedal posture and their carnivorous diet. They were, in a deeper biological sense, already pre-adapted for the transition that would eventually transform some of their descendants into the dominant vertebrate fauna of the modern world, because they possessed a constellation of anatomical and physiological characteristics that, in combination, represented a unique biological platform on which the evolution of flight could be built. Bipedalism was the most fundamental of these pre-adaptations. When the early theropods evolved upright bipedal locomotion in the Triassic, a shift driven by competitive pressures in the complex ecological arena of the early Mesozoic, in which various groups of archosaurs were competing for the ecological roles that the Permian extinction had left open. They made a choice, in the language of evolutionary contingency, that freed their forelimbs from any locomotory function. In a quadruped, the forelimbs are weight-bearing structures constrained by the demands of supporting and propelling the body. They can evolve for other functions, for digging, for grasping, for climbing, but they do so under the constant constraint that they must also function as legs. In a biped, the forelimbs are genuinely free, freed from weight-bearing, freed from propulsion, freed from the conservative pressure that locomotory function imposes on limb anatomy. The arms of a theropod could evolve in any direction that natural selection pushed them, unconstrained by the need to remain functional legs. They evolved, in different lineages, into grasping tools for capturing prey, into display structures, and eventually into wings. The hollow bones of theropods, technically called pneumatized bones because they were invaded by air sacs connected to the respiratory system, reduced the metabolic cost of building and maintaining the skeleton, while also reducing its weight without compromising its structural strength. This pneumatization was not primarily a flight adaptation in the theropods that first evolved it. It was a respiratory adaptation, connected to the flow-through breathing system that theropods inherited from the archosaur ancestors they shared with modern crocodilians and birds. A breathing system more efficient than the tidal breathing of mammals because air flows in one direction through the lungs rather than in and out of a dead-end sac. The pneumatization that reduced weight and enabled efficient oxygen extraction in running theropods would prove equally valuable in flying birds, where weight reduction and respiratory efficiency are among the most critical performance parameters. The theropods did not evolve hollow bones in order to fly. They evolved hollow bones in order to run and breathe efficiently, and the birds inherited them in a context where their value was multiplied. The metabolic rate of theropods, a subject of intense paleontological investigation for decades, now largely resolved in favor of endothermy, at least in the coelurosaurs, provided the energetic foundation for flight. Powered flight is the most energetically demanding form of locomotion in the animal kingdom, requiring sustained output from the flight muscles at rates that can exceed resting metabolic rate by a factor of 10 or more. The sustained muscular activity of flight is only possible for an animal with a metabolic system capable of delivering and processing oxygen at the rates required. A metabolic system, in other words, that is endothermic rather than ectothermic. The evidence for endothermy in theropod coelurosaurs comes from multiple sources. The bone histology of fast-growing fibrolamellar bone characteristic of endotherms, rather than the slower-growing lamellar zonal bone of ectotherms. The isotopic composition of theropod tooth enamel, which preserves a signal of body temperature consistent with endothermy, and the presence of feather-like insulating structures in small-bodied coelurosaurs, which would serve no thermoregulatory function in an ectotherm. The metabolic capacity for flight existed in coelurosaurs before flight did. Another pre-adaptation, another component of the biological platform on which birds were eventually assembled. The wishbone, the furcula, formed by the fusion of the two clavicles into a single V-shaped or U-shaped structure, was long considered a uniquely avian characteristic, a defining feature of birds that distinguished them from their reptilian ancestors. The discovery that the furcula is in fact present in virtually all theropods, and not just birds and their closest relatives, was one of the more significant reassessments produced by the renewed examination of theropod anatomy in the light of the dinosaur bird hypothesis. In modern birds, the furcula functions as a spring in the flight stroke, storing elastic energy during the downstroke and releasing it at the end of the stroke to assist the recovery of the wing, a biomechanical function that requires the furcula to be flexible rather than rigid, bending and springing back with each wing beat. Whether the furculas of non-avian theropods functioned as springs in this way, or served a different mechanical role in the context of running locomotion, is not fully resolved, but their presence across the theropod lineage indicates that this structure, which would prove essential to flight mechanics in the birds, was a deeply conserved theropod feature rather than a bird-specific innovation. When Sinosauropteryx was described in 1996 from the Liaoning Formation of northeastern China, the immediate response of the paleontological community was a mixture of excitement and productive skepticism. The simple, filamentous integumentary structures preserved along the dorsal surface of the animal, structures that the original describers Ji Qiang and Ji Shuan identified as proto-feathers, were unlike anything previously described in a dinosaur, and they were sufficiently unexpected that some researchers proposed alternative explanations. Degraded collagen fibers from the subcutaneous connective tissue, a fringe of epidermal scales, some other non-homologous integumentary structure. The skepticism was not unreasonable. Extraordinary claims in paleontology, as in all sciences, require extraordinary evidence. But the Liaoning specimens that followed Sinosauropteryx in the years after 1996 provided that extraordinary evidence in accumulating quantities that eventually overwhelmed the alternative hypotheses. Archaeopteryx zui, described in 1998, had large, symmetrical, pennaceous feathers on its tail and forelimbs, not the simple filaments of Sinosauropteryx, but genuine feathers with a rachis, barbs, and the characteristic planar arrangement of modern contour feathers. Archaeopteryx was clearly incapable of flight. Its body mass and the symmetric arrangement of its feathers made aerodynamic lift generation impossible. But the presence of fully developed pennaceous feathers in an animal that could not fly was itself a profoundly important result, because it confirmed that advanced feather morphology, the kind of feather morphology that would eventually serve aerodynamic functions, evolved before flight in a non-flying context, for functions that had nothing to do with aerodynamics. Display was the most obvious candidate. The large, symmetrical tail fan of Archaeopteryx, strikingly similar in its arrangement to the display fans of modern peacocks and birds of paradise, almost certainly served a sexual selection function, advertising the quality of the bearer to potential mates. Bapiosaurus inexpectus, described in 1999, extended the range of feather-bearing theropods beyond the small, bird-like coelurosaurs into a much larger and more distantly related group. The therizinosaurs, large-bodied, herbivorous theropods that could reach body masses of several tons in their largest forms. The proto-feathers of Bapiosaurus covered a body that was in almost every other respect unlike a bird, large, slow, herbivorous, with enormous clawed forelimbs adapted for pulling down vegetation rather than for flight or display. Their presence on such an unlikely animal indicated that feather-like integumentary structures had spread across the entire coelurosaur lineage, appearing in herbivores as well as carnivores, in large-bodied forms as well as small ones, confirming that feathers were a basal characteristic of the coelurosaur grade, rather than a specialized innovation confined to the bird-adjacent lineages. Sinornithosaurus millenni, also from the Liaoning Formation and described in 1999, was perhaps the most anatomically significant of the early Liaoning discoveries in terms of its position on the family tree and its relevance to the question of when avian characteristics were assembled. Sinornithosaurus was a dromaeosaurid, a member of the same group as Velociraptor and Deinonychus, and it possessed a combination of features that placed it right at the interface between the unambiguously non-avian and the potentially avian. A wishbone, a semi-lunate carpal bone in the wrist, allowing the folding motion characteristic of the avian wing stroke, forelimb proportions closer to birds than to most non-avian theropods, and a body covering of filamentous proto-feathers. More than any of the other early Liaoning discoveries, Sinornithosaurus demonstrated that the package of anatomical features associated with the origin of birds, the features that would eventually be assembled with additional elaborations into the first flying animal, was already being constructed piece by piece in the dromaeosaurid lineage, in animals that were not birds and not yet flying, driven by selection pressures whose connection to flight was indirect at best. The question of why feathers evolved the asymmetric structure, and more broadly, why feathers became flight feathers rather than remaining simple insulating or display structures, is inseparable from the question of how flight itself originated. And this question has generated one of the longest-running and most productive scientific debates in the history of vertebrate paleontology. The debate has two primary camps, distinguished by their proposed sequence of events and their identification of which anatomical changes preceded which. The trees down hypothesis proposes that the ancestors of birds were arboreal, tree-dwelling, animals that evolved the ability to glide from branch to branch or from tree to ground, and that powered flight developed as an elaboration of this gliding behavior, with the proto-wings providing first passive gliding lift, and then, with the addition of active flapping, genuine powered flight. The ground-up hypothesis proposes that the ancestors of birds were terrestrial, ground-dwelling, cursorial animals that evolved the ability to run rapidly on two legs, and that the proto-wings developed initially as aids to stability and maneuverability during rapid locomotion, or as aids to capturing prey, before eventually developing the aerodynamic capacity to generate enough lift to leave the ground. Both hypotheses have strong evidence in their favor and serious anatomical objections. The trees down hypothesis is supported by the general principle that gliding is energetically cheaper than powered flight, and therefore represents a more plausible intermediate stage. An animal that can glide from a height gains the energy of its altitude as kinetic energy in the glide, while an animal attempting to take off from the ground must generate enough lift from zero velocity to overcome its own weight. A much more energetically demanding proposition. The ground-up hypothesis is supported by the general body plan of the coelurosaurs that are most closely related to birds, which are predominantly terrestrial rather than arboreal, with hind limb proportions adapted for fast running rather than tree climbing. A study published in July 2025 by Pittman and colleagues at the University of Hong Kong, examining the pisiform, a small wrist bone previously overlooked in the analysis of bird flight origins, found that this bone evolved earlier in the theropod lineage than previously appreciated, and that its early evolution may have contributed to the development of the wing-folding mechanism that allows modern birds to fold their wings against their bodies between flight strokes. The pisiform finding adds a new anatomical data point to the ground-up versus trees-down debate, suggesting that the wrist adaptations necessary for efficient flight were being assembled in predominantly terrestrial theropods, long before any arboreal behavior can be demonstrated. The discovery of Microraptor gui in 2003 from the Jiufotang Formation of Liaoning Province introduced a third possibility that neither the trees down nor the ground-up hypothesis had anticipated. An animal that was neither a pure glider nor a pure ground runner, but a four-winged creature of extraordinary aerodynamic complexity, whose flight mechanics defied easy categorization within the existing theoretical framework. Microraptor was a small dromaeosaurid, a close relative of Velociraptor in the same group as the Jurassic Park animal, with a body length of approximately 77 centimeters and a body mass estimated at 1 kilogram. What made it exceptional were the long, asymmetric, pennaceous flight feathers on its hind limbs as well as its forelimbs, creating a configuration in which all four limbs bore aerodynamic surfaces capable of generating lift. A study published in PNAS in January 2026 by researchers from the Chinese University of Hong Kong, the University of Hong Kong, and Dakota State University investigated the aerodynamics of Microraptor's four-winged configuration using computational fluid dynamics modeling applied to updated wing shape reconstructions. The study found that the forelimb wings and hindlimb wings of Microraptor interacted aerodynamically in ways that increased overall lift efficiency. The airflow accelerated over the forelimb wings created a favorable pressure field that enhanced the lift generated by the hindlimb wings behind them, a tandem wing interaction analogous to certain modern aircraft designs. The four-winged configuration, the study concluded, represented a genuinely effective aerodynamic solution, not a clumsy intermediate, not a failed experiment, but a functional and efficient gliding platform that may have allowed Microraptor to exploit the arboreal environment of the Liaoning forest canopy with considerable agility. Microraptor was not the only evolutionary experiment in avian-adjacent flight that the Cretaceous produced. Yi Qi, a Scansoriopterygoid dinosaur from the Middle to Late Jurassic of China, described in 2015, had elongated wrist bones that supported a membrane wing, analogous in general structure to the wing of a bat or a flying squirrel rather than the feather-supported wing of a bird. Yi Qi had feathers on its body, but its primary wing surface was a skin membrane stretched between the elongated wrist styliform bone and the body, a fundamentally different aerodynamic architecture from anything in the bird lineage. Anchiornis huxley, a troodontid from the late Jurassic of China, was so bird-like in its anatomy that its original description placed it as a bird, and it was only re-examined as a non-avian dinosaur after subsequent phylogenetic analysis. Archaeopteryx, an oviraptorosaur, had large, symmetrical flight feathers on its tail and forelimbs, but a body plan incompatible with flight, the feathers clearly serving display rather than aerodynamic functions. Each of these animals represents a different evolutionary solution to the problem of integrating feathers into a functional body plan, and in most cases the solution led nowhere in particular. The lineage went extinct without leaving avian descendants. An evolutionary experiment that ran, produced interesting results, and then ended. The aerodynamic significance of the asymmetric feather, the airfoil geometry, the pressure differential, the lift generation has been established. What remains is the question of how Archaeopteryx actually used it. The ground-up versus trees-down debate has accumulated a vast literature across more than a century of investigation, and the details of both positions have become considerably more nuanced than the simple opposing slogans suggest. The trees-down position, in its modern form, is not simply the claim that bird ancestors lived in trees and glided down from them. It is a broader argument about the energetics of flight origins. That passive gliding, which requires no muscular input and harvests the energy of altitude, is a more plausible intermediate stage between non-flight and powered flight than any ground-based intermediate. Because a gliding animal that gradually increases the muscular contribution to its flight can transition smoothly to powered flight, as its flight muscles and aerodynamic surfaces co-evolve, while a ground-based animal attempting to generate lift from zero velocity faces a much steeper energetic barrier. The tree's down position is also supported by the aerodynamic modeling of Microraptor, which shows that the four-winged configuration is most aerodynamically efficient in the context of gliding from elevated positions. The hindwing configuration that generates the most efficient lift-to-drag ratio is one in which the hind limbs trail below and behind the forelimbs, a configuration natural for an animal descending from a tree and unnatural for one taking off from the ground. The ground-up position, in its modern form, argues from the biomechanics of theropod locomotion and from the anatomical constraints imposed by the theropod body plan. The ankle and hip joints of theropods, including the most bird-like dromaeosaurids, are structured for parasagittal locomotion, movement in a vertical plane, with the limbs swinging fore and aft beneath the body, rather than extending laterally from the body. This joint structure makes it anatomically difficult for a theropod to hold its hind limbs in the laterally extended position that would be required to use hind limb feathers as a second pair of wings, in the manner that Microraptor's feather arrangement seems to imply. The ground-up argument is that wings evolved as extensions of the arm-swinging, prey-grasping forearm motions of small cursorial theropods, the WAIR hypothesis, or wing-assisted incline running, which proposes that proto-wings evolved first as aids to running up steep inclines and capturing prey, generating aerodynamic force against the inclined surface to increase traction before generating enough lift to become true flight surfaces. Experimental support for the WAIR hypothesis comes from studies of modern ground-nesting birds such as the chukar partridge, which uses its wings in exactly the manner the hypothesis predicts, flapping immature wings against the surface during incline running to generate aerodynamic traction. Even at developmental stages, when the wings are too small and the feathers too undeveloped to generate significant lift, young chukars can run up inclines approaching 90 degrees using this technique, demonstrating that aerodynamic force generation by proto-wings has a selective advantage in a terrestrial context before it achieves the magnitude necessary for actual flight. The discovery that modern ground-nesting birds use a behavior that closely parallels what the WAIR hypothesis proposes for the earliest stages of wing evolution, is a form of indirect evidence that is difficult to dismiss, though it does not directly demonstrate that theropod dinosaurs actually used their proto-wings in this way. What the July 2025 pisiform study added to this debate was a new anatomical data point that bears on both hypotheses simultaneously. The pisiform is a small carpal bone, one of the bones in the wrist, that in modern birds contributes to the folding mechanism that allows the wing to be compactly folded against the body between flight strokes. Wing folding is essential to the efficient flight of modern birds because it reduces drag during the recovery stroke and allows the wing to cycle efficiently at high beat frequencies. The study found that the pisiform evolved and became structurally important earlier in the theropod lineage than had previously been appreciated, specifically in lineages that were not unambiguously arboreal, suggesting that the wing folding mechanism was being assembled in a terrestrial context before any demonstrably arboreal behavior can be identified in the fossil record. This finding is consistent with the ground-up hypothesis in suggesting that key flight-enabling anatomical innovations preceded arboreal behavior, but it is also consistent with a more nuanced position in which the components of the flight apparatus evolved in a terrestrial context and were later exploited for arboreal gliding as a stepping stone to powered flight. Yi Qi deserves extended attention because it represents the most dramatic departure from the feather-based aerodynamic architecture that all other Paravian gliders and flyers employed, and because its existence demonstrates just how far the evolutionary experimentation of the Jurassic and Cretaceous ranged beyond the pathway that actually led to birds. Yi Qi was small, approximately 380 grams, roughly the size of a European starling, and it inhabited a forested environment in what is now Inner Mongolia, approximately 160 million years ago. Its forelimbs had elongated wrist elements, including a rod-like styliform bone extending from the wrist that in life would have supported a thin membrane of skin connecting the forelimb to the body, analogous to the patagium of a modern bat or flying squirrel. Yi Qi also had feathers on its body and tail, but the primary aerodynamic surface of its wings was this membrane, rather than the pennaceous feathers that characterize every other known flying or gliding Paravian. This combination of feathers and a membranous wing surface is unique among all known dinosaurs and birds, living or extinct, and it suggests that the Paravian dinosaurs were experimenting with multiple radically different aerodynamic architectures simultaneously. That the feather-based wing was not the only solution being explored by the evolutionary process, and that the eventual dominance of feather-based flight over all other architectural options was not predetermined by any intrinsic superiority of the feather wing, but rather the result of which specific experiments happened to lead to lineages that survived. The aerodynamic performance of Anchiornis huxley was analyzed in unprecedented detail in a 2017 study that used preserved feather impressions from exceptionally well-preserved Liaoning specimens to reconstruct the actual wing shape of the animal and calculate its aerodynamic properties using computational fluid dynamics. The results showed that Anchiornis had aerodynamic surfaces capable of generating significant lift, particularly in a gliding configuration, but that its wing loading, the ratio of body weight to wing area, was relatively high compared to modern birds capable of sustained powered flight, suggesting that Anchiornis was primarily a glider rather than a flyer in the modern sense. The study also found evidence of the same hind limb feather arrangement seen in Microraptor, with long, pennaceous feathers on the legs that would have contributed additional lift surface in flight, making Anchiornis another potential four-winged glider, though smaller and less aerodynamically specialized than Microraptor. The existence of multiple species of four-winged paravians across different lineages and different geological time intervals suggests that the four-winged configuration was not an evolutionary oddity confined to one unusual lineage, but a recurring architectural solution that evolved independently in multiple paravian groups, and that the reduction to a two-winged configuration in the line leading to modern birds was itself an evolutionary-derived condition, not the ancestral state from which the four-winged forms departed. The transition to what we would recognize as genuine birds, animals capable of sustained powered flight and with body plans essentially similar to those of modern species, occurred during the early Cretaceous, in the 100-million-year interval between Archaeopteryx in the late Jurassic and the end Cretaceous mass extinction. The early Cretaceous bird fauna, known primarily from the Liaoning deposits but also from sites in Spain, South America and elsewhere, was dominated by two major groups that have no modern descendants, and that represent evolutionary branches that were eventually pruned from the avian family tree by the Cretaceous-Paleogene mass extinction. But the Cretaceous did not belong to one kind of bird. It belonged to two, and only one of them survived. The Hesperornithines, a group of large diving birds that had secondarily lost the ability to fly, retaining only vestigial wings while evolving powerful hind limbs for underwater propulsion, occupied the marine environments of the Cretaceous. Hesperornis regalis, the type species of the group, was approximately 1.5 meters long, with a long neck, powerful feet positioned far back on the body for underwater maneuvering, and a mouth full of teeth, the last significant occurrence of teeth in the bird lineage, eliminated along with the Hesperornithines themselves at the end of the Cretaceous. Ichthyornis dispar, by contrast, was a small tern-like bird capable of powerful flight, with asymmetric flight feathers and the wing musculature of an active flyer, but also with a toothed beak that gave its skull a distinctly non-modern appearance. The coexistence of Hesperornis and Ichthyornis in the shallow western interior seaway of North America, one a large flightless diver with teeth, the other a small flying seabird with teeth, illustrates the genuine diversity of Cretaceous avian ecology and the degree to which the Cretaceous bird fauna occupied a biological space quite different from the one inhabited by their modern descendants. The survivors of the Cretaceous-Paleogene mass extinction were members of the Neornithers, the modern birds, and specifically of a subset of the Neornithers that appears in the fossil record from the latest Cretaceous. How many lineages of Neornithers survived the extinction is a question that molecular phylogenetics has been attempting to answer for 3 decades, with results that have consistently surprised paleontologists expecting a simple picture. The molecular clock The use of mutation rates in DNA sequences to estimate divergence times between lineages suggests that many of the major orders of modern birds had their origins in the late Cretaceous, before the mass extinction, and that the diversification of modern bird groups during the Paleocene and Eocene represented the radiation of lineages that had survived the extinction with their fundamental genetic variation intact, rather than the rapid origination of new lineages from a few Paleocene survivors. The physical fossil record of latest Cretaceous birds, however, remains sparse enough that direct confirmation of pre-extinction diversification within the neornithers is difficult to achieve from bones alone. What allowed the ancestors of modern birds to survive the extinction that eliminated the enantiornithines, the hesperornithines, all non-avian dinosaurs, and approximately 75% of all species on Earth? The answer is almost certainly not a single factor, but a combination of characteristics that, in combination, placed the neornithers on the right side of a series of survival filters that the post-impact environment imposed. What allowed the ancestors of modern birds to survive the extinction that eliminated the enantiornithines, the hesperornithines, all non-avian dinosaurs, and approximately 75% of all species on Earth? The answer is almost certainly not a single factor, but a combination of characteristics that, in combination, placed the neornithers on the right side of a series of survival filters that the post-impact environment imposed. A study published in Science Daily in March 2026 added a further dimension to this picture, analyzing the evolutionary histories of lineages of feathered Paravian dinosaurs, the group that includes both the non-avian dromaeosaurids and the birds. The researchers found evidence that some feathered dinosaurs may have evolved powered flight capabilities independently, only to subsequently lose them as their lineages adapted to ecological roles for which flight was unnecessary or energetically costly. This secondary loss of flight, well documented in modern birds, which have evolved flightlessness independently dozens of times in island environments, appears, according to this analysis, to have occurred in some non-avian dinosaur lineages as well, meaning that the evolutionary history of flight in the theropod bird continuum was not a simple trajectory from flightlessness toward flight, but a complex back and forth in which flight capabilities were gained and lost multiple times in different lineages. This finding complicates the interpretation of non-flying feathered dinosaurs, like Archaeopteryx and the oviraptorosaurs, rather than necessarily representing animals that had never achieved flight and were in the process of evolving toward it. Some of them may represent the descendants of flying ancestors that had secondarily abandoned powered flight for ground-dwelling lifestyles. Evolution running in reverse, the wings of flight repurposed for display, brooding, or aerodynamic stability during fast running. The success of birds as a group is, by any quantitative measure, extraordinary. There are approximately 10,000 species of birds alive today, more than the combined total of mammal species, which number approximately 6,000. Birds occupy every biome on Earth, from the driest deserts to the highest mountain peaks, from tropical rainforests to the Antarctic ice sheet. The wandering albatross spends the first 6 years of its life in continuous flight over the Southern Ocean, never landing on solid ground, covering distances in that period that exceed the circumference of the Earth many times over. The Arctic tern migrates from the Arctic to the Antarctic and back every year, a round trip of approximately 70,000 kilometers, and does so for a lifespan of up to 30 years, logging more total distance in flight than any other animal in the history of life on Earth. The peregrine falcon reaches speeds exceeding 300 kilometers per hour in a stoop, the fastest sustained movement of any animal on the planet. The bee hummingbird of Cuba weighs less than 2 grams, the smallest warm-blooded animal in existence, its heart beating at more than 1,200 times per minute during flight. Each of these performances is the end point of a specific evolutionary trajectory that began in the theropod dinosaurs of the Jurassic and wound through the extraordinary variety of experimental forms that the Cretaceous produced. The crow on your fence is the inheritor of 160 million years of evolutionary refinement, beginning in a small feathered theropod that lived in forests we can no longer locate, continuing through animals that we are still naming and describing in laboratories around the world, surviving a catastrophe that ended the reign of every other large animal on the planet, and diversifying in the aftermath of that catastrophe into the most successful radiation of land vertebrates in the history of the Earth. When a bird spreads its wings, it is not performing a behavior that a biologist designed or a physicist calculated. It is performing the accumulated result of 80 million years of evolutionary trials, most of which failed, a handful of which succeeded beyond any reasonable expectation, and one of which, the line that led to the neo-nithers, survived the unsurvivable and became the dominant vertebrate fauna of the modern world. The story of the enantiornithines deserves more than a passing mention, because these birds, the dominant avian lineage of the Cretaceous, the group that occupied the ecological space of birds for 80 million years before the asteroid ended their reign, are in many ways more interesting than the neornithines that replaced them. They were not primitive, undeveloped proto-birds waiting to be replaced by more advanced forms. They were fully functional, ecologically diverse, aerodynamically sophisticated birds that had solved the problems of flight in their own way and had been solving them successfully for longer than the entire subsequent history of modern birds. Understanding what they were and why they vanished while their neornithine relatives survived is essential to understanding why the modern avifauna looks the way it does. The enantiornithines were named for a distinctive anatomical feature of their shoulder girdle. The coracoid and scapula articulate in a reversed orientation compared to modern birds, a difference that presumably reflects a somewhat different arrangement of the flight musculature, though the functional consequences of this difference remain debated. In most other respects, enantiornithines were recognizable as birds. They had wings with asymmetric flight feathers. They had feet adapted for perching in many species, and the most derived members of the group had lost the teeth that characterized more primitive birds and replaced them with beaks. But they retained features that modern birds have lost. Most had clawed wing digits, visible in well-preserved specimens, as small curved claws at the leading edge of the wing, and many retained teeth in the jaws, giving them a more archaic facial appearance than any modern bird. The Liaoning Formation has produced enantiornithine specimens of extraordinary quality, including animals preserved with soft tissue, with color indicating melanosomes in the feathers, and in some cases with eggs or embryos providing direct evidence of reproductive biology. Longipteryx chaoyangensis had a long, forceps-like beak specialized for catching fish, demonstrating that the enantiornithines had diversified into specialist ecological roles comparable to those of modern herons and kingfishers. Confuciusornis zanctus, technically not an enantiornithine but a closely related contemporaneous form, is known from thousands of specimens from the Liaoning beds, making it one of the most abundantly represented fossil birds in the world, and its preservation in mass mortality assemblages suggests that it lived in large flocks comparable to those of modern starlings or swallows. Gobipteryx minuta, from the late Cretaceous of Mongolia, had a toothless beak and an advanced skeletal architecture suggesting a high level of aerodynamic refinement, demonstrating that the enantiornithines were still evolving and diversifying right up to the extinction boundary, rather than declining in the millions of years before the impact. The hesperornithines, mentioned briefly in the main narrative, also deserve fuller treatment because they represent one of the most dramatic secondary losses of flight in the vertebrate record. An entire order of birds that, having evolved flight over tens of millions of years of theropod and early avian evolution, subsequently abandoned it in favor of a fully aquatic pursuit diving lifestyle. The hesperornithines first appeared in the fossil record in the early Cretaceous and reached their greatest diversity in the shallow epicontinental seas of the late Cretaceous, particularly the western interior seaway that divided North America into eastern and western landmasses during much of the Cretaceous period. Their hind limbs were positioned so far back on the body that walking on land must have been nearly impossible. They were, functionally, committed to an aquatic existence, in the same way that modern loons are committed to water, able to move on land only with great difficulty, but supremely capable in the water. Their wings were reduced to vestigial flippers, retaining the basic bone structure of the avian wing, but stripped of the flight feathers and musculature that would have made powered flight possible. What they retained from their flying ancestors, the teeth, the general vertebral plan, the basic organization of the nervous system, was essentially everything that was not specifically connected to flight. The oral papillae discovered in the Chicago Archaeopteryx specimen, soft tissue structures in the mouth that O'Connor and colleagues interpreted as evidence of a mobile, muscular tongue and a feeding apparatus capable of manipulating prey items within the oral cavity, add another dimension to the picture of what Archaeopteryx was actually doing with its days in the Jurassic Lagoon environment. Modern birds use their tongues in highly varied ways. Woodpeckers have enormously elongated tongues that wrap around the inside of the skull and can extend centimeters beyond the bill tip to probe for insects in bark cavities. Hummingbirds have bifurcated, lapping tongues that transfer nectar from flowers at extraordinary rates. Seed-eating finches use muscular tongues to manipulate and dehusk seeds with precision. The presence of soft tissue evidence, consistent with a functional tongue in Archaeopteryx, suggests that even the earliest birds were developing the versatile oral manipulation capabilities that would eventually allow their descendants to exploit an enormous range of food resources, and that the bird-feeding apparatus, like so much else in avian biology, had already begun its evolutionary trajectory toward versatility in the late Jurassic, 150 million years before the finches of the Galapagos demonstrated the endpoint of that trajectory to Charles Darwin. The feather color of early birds and feathered dinosaurs, a question that would have seemed permanently unanswerable until a decade ago, since color does not normally fossilize, has been partially resolved through the analysis of melanosomes, the microscopic organelles within feather cells that produce color through the deposition of melanin pigments. Different melanosome shapes produce different colors. Elongated, sausage-shaped eumelanosomes produce black and gray. Spherical pheomelanosomes produce reddish-brown and buff. By examining the shape and arrangement of melanosomes preserved in exceptionally well-maintained fossil feathers using scanning electron microscopy, researchers have been able to reconstruct the coloration of several early birds and feathered dinosaurs with a degree of confidence that would have seemed like science fiction as recently as 2010. Sinosauropteryx, the first feathered dinosaur described from Liaoning, had a reddish-brown and white banded tail, a coloration pattern strikingly similar to that of many modern mammals and ground-dwelling birds, suggesting a visual ecology of camouflage and conspecific communication. Microraptor had iridescent black plumage similar to the structural coloration of modern crows and ravens, produced by the layered arrangement of elongated eumelanosomes that creates thin film interference effects in incident light. A study published in 2024 and discussed in the context of the ancestral avian reconstruction suggested that the common ancestor of all modern birds likely had iridescent feathers, placing the origin of structural coloration in birds even earlier than the first modern bird lineages, in the deep avian ancestry of the Cretaceous. The sensory biology of early birds and their dinosaurian ancestors is another dimension of this story that the fossil record has, in recent years, begun to illuminate with unexpected precision. The brain endocasts of Archaeopteryx, casts of the interior of the brain case that preserve the external shape of the brain, show enlargement of the cerebellum and optic lobes relative to the brains of non-avian theropods, consistent with the enhanced visual processing and balance control that flight demands. The semicircular canals of the inner ear, which govern the sense of balance, are enlarged and reoriented in Archaeopteryx relative to non-avian theropods, suggesting that this animal had a significantly more sophisticated vestibular system, an enhanced ability to detect and respond to rotational accelerations in 3 dimensions than its non-flying relatives. These neurological refinements, detectable in fossils through the CT scanning of brain cases, confirm that the transition to flight was not purely a mechanical affair, a matter of growing the right feathers and developing the right muscle attachments, but involved a parallel reorganization of the nervous system, preparing the brain to process the sensory information that flight generates, and to issue the motor commands that controlling flight in 3 dimensions requires. The diversity of modern bird songs, calls, and vocal learning, the phenomenon by which songbirds acquire their songs by imitation, in a learning process that has striking parallels to human language acquisition, is itself a legacy of the Cretaceous transition. The vocal organ of birds, the syrinx, is unique to the avian lineage and has no equivalent in any other vertebrate group. It is located at the base of the trachea rather than in the throat, and it allows birds to produce two entirely independent sound streams simultaneously, explaining why a single bird can produce sounds of extraordinary complexity. The evolution of the syrinx occurred within the avian lineage after the divergence from the last common ancestor with other dinosaurs, and its elaboration in the neornithers, particularly in the oscine songbirds, which constitute more than half of all living bird species, produced the most complex vocal communication system in any non-human animal. The dawn chorus of a temperate forest in spring, with dozens of species singing simultaneously, is a sonic landscape created by 66 million years of post-Cretaceous avian evolution, building on an anatomical innovation that appeared sometime in the Mesozoic in animals whose fossil record does not preserve soft tissue well enough to tell us exactly when the syrinx first evolved. The Cretaceous Paleogene mass extinction, which occurred approximately 66 million years ago, when an asteroid approximately 10 to 15 kilometers in diameter struck the Yucatan Peninsula and released energy equivalent to billions of nuclear weapons, was the most catastrophic single event to affect the avian lineage in its entire history, and simultaneously the event that made the modern avifauna possible. The immediate physical consequences of the impact were devastating on a global scale. The vaporization of sulfur-rich Yucatan limestone released sulfur dioxide and sulfuric acid aerosols into the stratosphere, blocking sunlight and driving a global impact winter that suppressed photosynthesis for months to years. The superheated ejecta re-entering the atmosphere ignited wildfires across multiple continents. The collapse of primary productivity cascaded through food webs with a speed and completeness that eliminated not just individual species but entire ecological guilds simultaneously. For the birds of the latest Cretaceous, this meant the sudden and total elimination of the food resources that most of them depended on. The enantiornithines, the dominant birds of the Cretaceous, the group that had occupied the avian ecological space for 80 million years, appear from the fossil record to have been predominantly forest-dependent insectivores and frugivores. Animals adapted to the stable, resource-rich environment of Cretaceous forests and dependent on the continuous productivity of those forests for their survival. When the forests burned and then starved in the impact winter, the enantiornithines had nowhere to turn. Their ecological specialization, which had served them so well across 80 million years of stable Cretaceous conditions, became a death sentence in a world where the specific resources they depended on had been abruptly and catastrophically removed. The ancestors of modern birds survived not because they were ecologically superior to the enantiornithines in normal conditions, but because they happened to possess a combination of characteristics that provided resilience specifically in the post-impact environment. The evidence points to seed eating as a critical survival adaptation. Seeds are nutritionally dense, resistant to spoilage, and can remain viable in soil for years after the parent plant has died. Exactly the kind of food resource that would persist through an impact winter that destroyed living vegetation. The earliest post-Cretaceous bird faunas show a disproportionate representation of lineages with seed-eating adaptations. Thick bills, robust jaw muscles, gizzard anatomy suited for processing hard seeds, suggesting that the ability to exploit this specific food resource was a significant factor in determining which lineages made it through the initial post-impact bottleneck. Modern ground-dwelling birds like the chicken, the turkey, and their relatives retain the robust bill morphology and gizzard anatomy of their early Paleocene seed-eating ancestors, a morphological legacy of the survival filter that the Cretaceous Paleogene extinction imposed. The importance of small body size in post-impact survival cannot be overstated. Body size determines daily caloric requirements in a simple and direct way. A larger animal needs more food to maintain its metabolism, and in an environment where food productivity has collapsed by an order of magnitude, the animals with the lowest absolute caloric requirements have the greatest probability of finding enough food to survive. The survivors of the Cretaceous Paleogene extinction among the birds were predominantly small. Estimates suggest that the Neornithine lineages that made it through the extinction had body masses in the range of 100 to 200 grams, roughly the size of a large sparrow or a small pigeon. The largest birds of the Cretaceous, the Hesperornithines, which could reach 1.5 meters, went extinct entirely. The Enantiornithines, which included forms approaching the size of modern crows and ravens, went extinct entirely. The survivors were small, and their smallness was part of why they survived. Flight itself provided a survival advantage through geographic mobility that is easy to underestimate. The post-impact environment was not uniformly devastated. Certain regions, certain microhabitats, and certain food resources persisted even through the worst of the impact winter. An animal capable of flight could move hundreds or thousands of kilometers to locate a region of persistent food availability. A flightless animal was limited to what it could reach on foot. The distribution of surviving Neornithine lineages across multiple continents in the earliest Paleocene, documented in fragmentary form by the fossil record and more completely by molecular phylogenetics, suggests that the geographic mobility conferred by flight allowed surviving birds to exploit the patchwork of post-impact environments across the entire globe, rather than being limited to a single refugial region. The recovery of birds in the Paleocene was not a slow, gradual process. It was an explosion. Within 5 million years of the extinction, the major orders of modern birds had differentiated and begun their independent evolutionary trajectories. Within 10 million years, the ecological diversity of the modern avifauna was substantially established. The speed of this radiation reflects both the ecological opportunity created by the extinction of the Enantiornithines, the sudden availability of all the ecological roles they had occupied, and the evolutionary potential of the Neornithine body plan, which proved capable of rapid modification in response to the new ecological contexts it encountered. The same basic architecture, bipedal, feathered, hollow-boned, warm-blooded, fast metabolizing, that had been assembled over 80 million years of theropod evolution and refined over 80 million more years of early avian evolution proved, in the Paleocene radiation, to be one of the most versatile biological platforms in the history of vertebrates. The 10,000 species that resulted from this radiation occupy every ecological role available to a flying, warm-blooded vertebrate. and several roles that seem to push against the boundaries of what such an animal should be able to do. The bar-tailed godwit flies 11,000 kilometers non-stop from Alaska to New Zealand in 9 days without eating, drinking, or landing. A feat of sustained aerobic performance that requires the bird to reduce the size of its digestive organs before departure to save weight, then rebuild them upon arrival. The secretary bird of the African savanna hunts snakes on foot, using its powerful legs to stomp prey to death before swallowing it, a behavioral repertoire that would not seem out of place in a small theropod dinosaur. The palm cockatoo of New Guinea manufactures tools from plant stems and uses them to drum rhythmically on hollow logs, a form of instrumental music making that places it in the company of humans and a handful of other tool-using animals. The Clark's nutcracker buries tens of thousands of pine seeds in thousands of separate caches across a mountain landscape and recovers them months later using spatial memory of a precision that exceeds the performance of most human subjects in equivalent memory tasks. Each of these performances is the biological legacy of a transition that took 80 million years and proceeded through a succession of animals. Sinosauropteryx, Archaeopteryx, Microraptor, Confuciusornis, the unknown Neornithine survivor of the Cretaceous impact, each of which contributed something to the cumulative biological architecture that eventually produced a lineage capable of filling every flying ecological niche on a planet that for the previous 160 million years had been dominated by their non-flying ancestors. The philosophical dimension of the dinosaur-to-bird transition is one that science rarely addresses directly, but that sits quietly behind every fossil description, every phylogenetic analysis, every CT scan of an Archaeopteryx brain case. We are the first species in the history of life on Earth that has been able to reconstruct, in meaningful detail, the evolutionary history of the animals that share the planet with us. Every other species lives in an eternal present, surrounded by other species whose origins are invisible to it. We alone can look at a crow and know, with the precision that 160 years of accumulating fossil evidence and 2 decades of molecular phylogenetics provide, that this animal's ancestors walked on the ground in a Jurassic forest, that its wings grew from the arms of a running predator, that its feathers began as filaments on the back of an animal that could not fly, that its survival of the Cretaceous catastrophe was contingent on a combination of small size, dietary flexibility, and the seed-bearing plants that managed to persist through the impact winter. We can know all of this. No other animal on this planet can know anything comparable about its own history. The 14 specimens of Archaeopteryx collected over 164 years represent, in aggregate, something more than a collection of transitional fossils. They represent the pace at which the deep history of life reveals itself. Slowly, incompletely, through geological accidents of preservation that concentrate the evidence in specific places and specific formations while leaving the vast majority of the history unrecorded. For every Archaeopteryx specimen that has been found, thousands of individuals must have died in the Jurassic lagoons without being preserved, their bones dissolving in oxygenated water, their feathers scattering and decaying, their entire existence leaving no trace in the rock. The 14 that were preserved and found and recognized for what they were, and subjected to the CT scanners and the electron microscopes and the isotope mass spectrometers, represent an extraordinary run of geological luck, and they have been enough to tell us most of what we know about one of the most important biological transitions in the history of vertebrates. The 14th specimen, with its tertial feathers and its cranial kinesis and its soft tissue oral papillae, was described in 2025. The 15th has not been found yet. When it is found, whether in a Bavarian limestone quarry or in a museum collection where it has been waiting unrecognized for decades, or in some formation not yet discovered, it will add something to this picture. It will change something we think we know. It will raise a question that none of the previous 14 raised. That is how this story works. It does not end with a final answer. It ends with a better question, and then another fossil, and then a better question still, and then a bird on your windowsill that you will never be able to look at in exactly the same way again. Birds are not the descendants of dinosaurs. They are dinosaurs, the only ones left. And every time one of them takes flight, the entire history of that transition, from Sinosauropteryx shaking its proto-feathered coat in a Cretaceous forest, to Archaeopteryx spreading its toothed and clawed wings over a Jurassic lagoon, to the first neornithine survivor picking through the ash of a post-impact wasteland, is compressed into a single wingbeat and repeated.